What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Danny and Bush coming at you with our first dose of our redraft rankings. These are our, June rankings. This is going to be coming out May 31st. Our first dose of our quarterback rankings. We're going to go through our top 12 quarterbacks today. Running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends we're going to go through throughout the week. Now that we're into June, we're going to be getting into a lot more redraft content. We started it last week. We're going to get into our first dose of rankings, as I mentioned, and then we're going to get into some more sleepers, busts, and typical redraft type of content. So, Danny, how are you doing today?
Doing well. And as Corey was alluding to, we're going to be starting off this list with our top 12 quarterbacks in redraft fantasy football. Have to repeat that for the YouTube algorithm. And if you guys enjoy content like this, are interested in seeing the rest of our rankings, are interested in seeing a jam-packed offseason of both dynasty and redraft content, make sure you go hit that subscribe button because we're going to be coming at you every single day.
Right. Yeah. And make sure if you guys want to get in, and you can use these rankings right away to impact your best ball drafts going on Underdog Fantasy right now. You can use promo code FSE at sign up and deposit, and you guys can get both of our draft guides totally for free. So that's an amazing deal that we have going there. You can also get $25 when you sign up to enter the Best Ball Mania contest, which gives you a chance at $1 million. So all that being said, we're going to hit the intro and we're going to get into the first guy. Okay, so we're going to start our consensus rankings right now. You'll be able to see them on the screen. If you're just looking for the numbers, you don't need to hear any rationale behind it. You can see them right now on the screen. That's what our consensus rankings are. I encourage you not to comment anything down below why we have someone too low or too high before actually hearing why we have them, where we have them. But we're going to start with Patrick Mahomes. And Danny, I will let you take that one away.
Yeah, guys, is there really a surprise as to who number one is on each of our lists? I mean, this is the best quarterback we've seen, quite possibly maybe from a talent standpoint, in the NFL's history. I mean, when we're talking about Patrick Mahomes, he not only is the best quarterback talent currently in the NFL, but currently has the best supporting cast you could possibly ask for. You're talking about a guy who we're going to be talking about in the wide receiver rankings, going to figure himself at the top. We're going to be talking about a tight end who's finished as the number one tight end each of the last 5 years. This is a quarterback with great elite talents around him who in the past 3 years has finished as the quarterback 1, quarterback 5, and quarterback 1 respectively in points per game amongst quarterbacks with 10 plus games played. I don't have to go too long to make the case for Patty at 1. It's pretty easy. I mean, it's just at this point, if you're talking about any quarterback in the NFL and you're talking about a guy that we can most easily project for at minimum a top 5 finish at the quarterback position in terms of points per game, it's going to be Patrick Mahomes. So there's no reason not to have him at 1.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mahomes anytime he's been on the field, he's been a bona fide advantage in fantasy football. And that's not something you can say about a lot of other quarterbacks, because I'm sure everybody that's listening to this right now knows that late round quarterback is a strategy that people employ. And the reason for it is the fact that usually the QB2, QB3 in fantasy is not much different from the QB 15 in fantasy. Well, the reason it's the QB2, QB3 is because we have Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes is that difference maker, is that much better than the competition. And we have some guys that are, chasing his tails right now, but at the same time, they're still not going to catch him. He's still the best quarterback in the league. He has one of the best supporting casts, play caller, protection definitely improved. That's something we should touch on real quick. They added Joe Thuney at left guard, who's one of the best guards in the league. They added Orlando Brown to play left tackle for him, which is a big time upgrade, honestly, over Eric Fisher to begin with, and especially who he was starting in the Super Bowl with Eric Fisher out. So they made additions to this offensive line. They're probably going to continue to add to it, to be honest, as well. And they have some young guys that can figure into that right tackle spot. And all that being said, Patrick Mahomes was still so good last year with questionable protection, with Schwartz out, with Fisher out, with LDT opting out of the season. So he's basically still one of the best quarterback options in the NFL, especially for fantasy.
Going on to the next option, we're going to be talking about number 2. Take it away with Lamar Jackson from the Baltimore Ravens.
Yeah, so consensus-wise, this was the QB 1 and 2 last year, and I see no reason why that should change. I know a lot of people are probably going to have Josh Allen as QB 2. He finished as QB 1 last year, and a lot of people probably think that Lamar Jackson was not good last year, especially at the beginning of the season. But After the Ravens figured their shit out, basically, Jackson was the QB2 in points per game from week 10 onward. And if you look at his game logs, you can see how consistent he was as well, scoring 20 points per game in every game except for one. And he saw his front office and his offensive coordinator go out and really commit to building around him as far as his pass catchers are concerned. Because we know exactly the main reason I have Lamar Jackson at QB2 is because of that 1,000-yard, 5 to 8 touchdown type of rushing output that he can provide, which is more than Josh Allen can provide. It's more than Kyler Murray can provide. It's more than Dak Prescott and Justin Herbert can provide. Lamar Jackson is set to see an actual progression in his career from a passing perspective. And remember, this is a guy that led the NFL in passing touchdowns 2 years ago. It's not like this guy's never done it from a passing perspective in his career. He did it two seasons ago. He was the best passer in the NFL. And Lamar Jackson last year had 40 passes dropped. His receiving core needed serious work. And if he can improve marginally as a passer, and like I said, keep up that 1,000-yard, 5 to 8 touchdown type of rushing output that he's always had, we're looking at a top 3 quarterback lock. And the reason I have him ahead of Dak Prescott and Josh Allen and Kyler Murray is because I feel the most comfortable projecting him for a top 5 finish of those guys. Because if those guys have down passing outputs, they're going to be severely affected. If Lamar Jackson has a down passing output similar to what we saw this year, he can still make up for it with his rushing. And I think that rushing alone, when you look at a mathematical perspective, gives you more fantasy points, which is why I think he's more valuable than those guys.
Well, we could talk about that real quick for the people that aren't sure about, you guys keep referencing Konami code. Why is that so significant? Why is that so valuable when you're projecting quarterbacks? First of all, we're referencing Konami code because of a guy like Lamar Jackson, this elite edge you have from a rushing standpoint. Let's just talk about it from a number standpoint, right? You get 0.04 points for every passing yard, and you get 0.1 for every rushing yard. Basically, what that means is if you do the math, a rushing yard is 2.5 times more valuable than a passing yard. And then you combine the rushing aspect. Usually you're in 4-point passing touchdown leagues. Rushing touchdowns are usually worth 6 points. So if you're doing the math and a quarterback's giving you 700 rushing yards and 7 rushing touchdowns, that's what, 42 points for the touchdowns and roughly 70 points for the rushing yards. So overall, you're getting 112 added points from a quarterback that you're not even just remotely you're not even considering the passing yet, and you're getting 112 points based off solely the rushing. So
right, overall, and that's like that type of rushing volume is like 3,000 passing yards like worth of volume on fantasy points for a passing perspective. So I think everybody knows it by now. We could probably move on to the next quarterback, which is your guy. So we'll go into our QB3 right now, which is Dak Prescott, quarterback of the Dallas Cowboys.
Yeah, otherwise known as the 2021 MVP. I'm going to make my claim right now. This is going to be the 2021 MVP winner. You guys can get out all your bias comments, all you want right now. Let me get in depth as to why Dak Prescott is going to explode onto the scene this year and is going to be that difference maker from a fantasy football and real life perspective. So we're talking about this. He was on pace to really tear up that league in 2020 prior to that unfortunate ankle injury. The unforeseen passing volume, we've never seen a quarterback hit the heights, hit the sheer volume, sheer passing output that Dak was hitting. For the reference, Dak Prescott had more total touchdowns than Daniel Jones on the season last year. Daniel Jones started 13 games? Dak started 5. So let's keep that into mind. He actually didn't even finish his 5th game. You're getting the elite passing upside, getting nearly 1,900 yards, 9 touchdowns in 4.5 games played last year. And we mentioned the rushing factor. We want a quarterback that can contribute on the ground game to supplement those fantasy points. Well, we're talking about a guy in Dak Prescott who has shown throughout his career that he can put the ball in the end zone from a rushing perspective. 24 rushing touchdowns in 69 career games. Nice. But when you're talking about the Dak Prescott, the main thing that people are going to point at is, he was averaging 44 passing attempts per game last year. That's got to go down because let's be honest, that's not maintainable. That's not sustainable for a full season. But if you're going to mention his high passing attempts per game, you also have to counterbalance that with the fact that he only had a 4% touchdown rate, which when we'll get into Josh Allen, who was at 6.5%, is very low for a guy of Dak Prescott's throwing standards. I mean, when we're talking about Dak Prescott, 6.5% should be about the rate that he should be able to get to this year, especially given the adequate weapons you have on the outside. And quite frankly, he just had some bad touchdown luck last year in those games played. Despite all that, was the quarterback 1 in points per game when he was on the field. And you're talking about a guy, let's just look at it from a face value standpoint. Look at it straight. general look, you're talking about a guy who's almost a lock for 5,000 passing yards in the 17-game season, should near 40-plus passing touchdowns, and contribute roughly 300 yards and 5 rushing touchdowns. You're getting the full package of basically what we hope for from Mahomes on a year-end basis. We can project probably a small downgrade from Mahomes as to what Dak Prescott should be able to produce this year.
Yeah, from a production standpoint, look, I mean, I know a lot of people are going to argue about how good of a quarterback Dak Prescott is. We both believe he's a great quarterback, but a lot of people are going to, nitpick him and things of that nature. When you look at the quarterback situation that he's in, he has the great weapons around him, good protection, should be healthy this year, great running back behind him. Everything that he has is what we want for all these quarterbacks that are coming up, like Joe Burrow and stuff. We want these guys to be surrounded with talent the way Dak Prescott is, and that's going to lead to him being a high-value fantasy quarterback. Now, full disclosure, I don't have him as my QB3. I have Josh Allen as my QB3, and you have him as your QB2, I believe, which is why he's our consensus QB3. So I'm a little bit lower on Dak Prescott than you are, understandably so, because, I mean, you follow the team a lot more than I do.
I just got one more thing I'm going to say, because people might point directly to, well, you're taking a sample size of 5 games and basically saying, well, he was leading them in points per game last year. That means he should be back up there. Well, you actually take the sample size of 2019 as well, where he was the quarterback 2 in fantasy and has only gotten better weapons since that year. So overall, having him at 2, I believe, is fully justifiable, as I've mentioned.
Yeah, and I understand it. They're all in the same tier, and we haven't touched on tiers yet, but we believe that Mahomes is in his own tier, and these next 4 guys or so are in a tier together. So I wouldn't blame you for the guy that we have at QB5 being your QB2, and vice versa. I think all of these guys are somewhat interchangeable. I have Lamar Jackson at 2. You have Dak Prescott at 2. I would assume most people have Josh Allen at 2. Some people might even have Kyler Murray at 2. All of these guys have a case for QB2. The question is, what do you weigh? How important is it? To me, rushing is the most important, which is why I have Lamar Jackson there. You believe, and this is all like fantasy is all about projecting forward. You believe an extreme passing ceiling is coming from Dak Prescott. And I think it's warranted. And when you think of all the factors, CeeDee Lamb in his second year, offensive line being healthy, Amari Cooper still there, obviously Michael Gallup's in his final year with the team. You definitely have the case to make. Blake Jarwin coming back from his ACL tear. Everything is lining up for Dak Prescott to have an absolutely exploding year from a fantasy perspective. So that's enough about Dak Prescott. We're going to get into Josh Allen, who is our consensus QB4, my QB3, Danny's QB4. When you think about Josh Allen, we know exactly what he did last year. He has 8+ rushing touchdowns in every season of his career, and he has no real stiff competition out of his running backs that will limit his goal line rushing exposure anytime soon. So that alone puts him ahead of a guy that, like Tom Brady, for example, that doesn't rush the ball. And then when you look at his season last year, 45 total touchdowns, 5K total yards in 2020, and he finishes the QB1. He is the whole package in terms of rushing and elite passing ability. The reason I have him at 3 and not at 2, like most people probably do, is because the Bills really didn't add anything to improve their offense. And I know that's really nitpicky. It's really lazy to say that the offense will regress. I'm not saying it will. They lost John Brown and they didn't replace him with anybody. Their RBs are the same. Their O-line is the same. The rest of the league has a whole year to figure out the Bills. And I'm not saying it's likely that they're going to regress or anything, but that is the downside risk. And when you're weighing these assets at the top, you kind of have to get a little nitpicky with it because they're all really good options. And he's only been an elite quarterback from a passing perspective for 1 year so far. And while his rushing is great, his passing could see a downtick. Again, not saying it's likely, but is there a 20% chance that Josh Allen and the Bills passing offense is not as explosive as it was last year? And that's basically what you're going to need if Mahomes is able to stay healthy and his situation improved. Lamar Jackson's able to stay healthy and his situation improved. I still have him at 3 ahead of Dak Prescott, but I do prefer Lamar Jackson with the improvements that the Ravens made, combined with how the Ravens closed out the season.
Yeah, and I don't fault anybody for having him, quite frankly, between 2 and 5. But yeah, when you're talking about Allen, the main attraction here is, yes, he had great strides improving as a passer last year. I mean, he was very phenomenal. The league-wide number 2 overall MVP candidate behind Aaron Rodgers. And when you're combining the factor, I mentioned Konami code, while he's not going to get into that Lamar Jackson or Kyler Murray territory, you're still talking about a guy who should have roughly 450, 500 rushing yards this year, combined with 6 to 9 touchdowns. So he's giving you factors from both sides. Again, you hit the nail on the head. The problem that I kind of have there is he hit his pinnacle year. We haven't really seen the sustained level of success from him from a multi-year standpoint. And in general, what if we're looking at Josh Allen's peak year this past season. Like, how are we really going to project forward? He was incredible. He was fantastic. He's proved that he's an elite quarterback talent. But again, the Bills, outside of Stephon Diggs, don't really have much to really go forward. Like, are you talking about Cole Beasley? Are you talking about Gabe Davis as really being his tertiary weapons? At least with Dak, from a passing volume standpoint, you got elite weapons. Patrick Mahomes, you got elite weapons. And Lamar Jackson, you got the rushing ability. So if I'm comparing and I'm splitting hairs between these top guys, I'm just going to take the more sure situations that I find with the Dallas core, with the Chiefs core, and with Lamar.
Right. And before we get into the next guy, we're going to, mention the fact that Allen does have a more secure situation than Kyler Murray, who is our quarterback 5. But again, you got to split hairs with these guys. They're all very, very good options. Like, none of these guys, it would shock me if any of them finishes the quarterback 1 on the season. They all have QB1 potential. They all have QB1 ceilings. So, and I think all of them have QB10 floors, to be honest, because they all provide in their own ways rushing ability and passing ability. And they all kind of have a different mix of each. Allen and Lamar have more, and Kyler have a lot more rushing ability than a guy like Mahomes does. Prescott has more passing. Mahomes has more passing. They all kind of interchange themselves. So we're going to go with QB5 now. Kyler Murray, quarterback of the Arizona Cardinals. And I'll let you get into it because Kyler Murray really had a tale of 2 seasons when you really break the numbers down.
Well, and like, let's just get through. You mentioned top 10. I'll be completely honest. From a point per game perspective, I mean, you could throw Deshaun Watson in this list pending what happens with the Texans, but I just don't really see any way any of these guys, if they play their seasons, are going to finish outside like the top 7 or 8 quarterbacks. That's how talented this top group is. So when we're talking about Kyler Murray being the 5, he has absolutely the opportunity of finishing 1. But the problem that I have with Kyler Murray is that he's got more question marks, in my opinion, comparatively to the top 4 options. So you mentioned it, tale of 2 seasons. I'm going to get into the numbers real quick. He was absolutely phenomenal the first 11 games last year, as I talked about in the quarter or dynasty rankings. But following that ankle injury or shoulder injury, to New England in week 12, he just wasn't really the same quarterback from a rushing output standpoint. So you guys can see the splits on the screen, the first 10 games versus his last 6. So in his first 10 games, he was giving you that Lamar Jackson type of ceiling from a rushing standpoint. Nearly 62 rushing yards per game, which equated across a full season is roughly about, I think it was 970. And he had a touchdown per game in that stretch. So he was clearly giving you that advantage. The problem is, as soon as he suffered that shoulder injury, we really saw the rushing output of the situation really go down for him. So his rushing yards nearly cut in half to 33.33, and his touchdowns per game predictably went down from a fully unsustainable 1 per game to 0.17. While I do think those rushing totals are probably going to find their way in between those 2 numbers, the fact that they were so willing to just cut all of his rushing sustained goal line usage that we saw at the beginning of the season versus the end kind of tells me that Cliff Kingsbury realized at the end of the season, okay, we just suffered a shoulder injury to our top young stud quarterback. Why are we risking the health of this guy when we can have guys like Kenyon Drake now? We can have guys who's replacing him like James Conner, Chase Edmonds, Rondale Moore in the second round to really take the load off in that area of the field. So if you're not getting 25 red zone rushing opportunities from Kyler Murray, are we really expecting him to repeat what he was doing in the first 11 games? I just don't think that's sustainable. While he's still going to be an elite option, while he's still going to be a clear-cut difference maker at the position, there's just so many red flags here in terms of situation, in terms of opportunity to really put him ahead of those top 4 guys, in my opinion.
Right. And I know it's super narrative-y because he's a small quarterback. He's 5'9" or 5'10". But it's a real thing, right? Like, you can't be taking those kind of hits when you're Kyler Murray, when you're the size of Kyler Murray. And from a preservation standpoint, you talked about it. Like, the Cardinals realize that Kyler is getting himself into trouble, and you can't have a guy like that who is that size be in that situation. But all that being said, this is still an elite quarterback option. This guy gives you a B+ version of Lamar Jackson from a rushing perspective. And even with that preservation that we're talking about, we're probably talking about a difference of 100 yards and like 3 rushing touchdowns. Yeah. But that's a difference that makes a difference when you're talking about all these elite options at the top of the board, which is why he's our QB5. I would not, think it's outlandish to have him as your QB2 because he was that good last year, especially before the shoulder injury. And if he's able to stay healthy and they use him the same exact way, they're just like, you just suffered an unfortunate injury last year, then we're talking about a guy that could absolutely finish as the QB1. So we're not dogging on Kyler Murray by having him QB5. We just think he's more risky. And especially from a passing perspective, He has DeAndre Hopkins as an established weapon. AJ Green doesn't inspire any confidence in either of us from a weapons perspective. Rondale Moore was a raw player coming out. Christian Kirk is still there, who's fine, but not that good. And Larry Fitzgerald is probably going to retire, if I had to imagine. He hasn't officially made any announcements yet, but he was a safety blanket for Kyler Murray, and he might not be there anymore either. And he's going to be replaced by Christian Kirk or Rondale Moore, which, I mean, is fine, but he has more questions, is our point, basically, than a guy like Dak Prescott has about his weapons, than a guy like Patrick Mahomes certainly has about his weapons, and even Lamar Jackson, because of his rushing ability, he can make up for his weapons to like the nth degree. So the next guy that we're going to get into is Justin Herbert. He's our QB6. He was QB6 last year, QB6 in points per game, and he finished as QB6 from week 2 on when he made his first start in the NFL. This is a guy that absolutely probably had one of the best rookie quarterback seasons that has ever happened, because he broke the rookie passing touchdown record. And not only that, but he ranked very highly in a number of throwing metrics. Number 6 in money throws, top 10 in every accuracy metric, including under pressure, which is very impressive for a young quarterback to be doing, and top 3 in play action completion percentage. And when you look at the situation around Justin Herbert, he had a COVID offseason, much like every other rookie did, but transitioning from the hardest position in sports to transition from college to the pros. And his offensive line ranked 30th in pass protection, 32nd in run blocking in his rookie season, coming from a system that he ran at Oregon that was not necessarily the most favorable for displaying his talents. I think it's super, super impressive what Justin Herbert did under a situation that only improved. He can become a more efficient passer with the addition of Rashawn Slater as his left tackle and a 3rd-round wide receiver in Josh Palmer. Hopefully Mike Williams and Keenan Allen are still doing their things. Austin Eckler finally healthy this year. He's really got everything that he needs to take that step into being an MVP level contender as a passer. He only registered 234 rushing yards last year and 5 rushing touchdowns. And I seriously think, and both of us compared him to this type of player from a physical traits perspective, but I think he has Josh Allen type rushing upside, which is about 500 plus rushing yards, 8 rushing touchdowns, which would be almost twice the amount of production he had this past year. And we have him just outside of this top tier, but it wouldn't shock me. Again, I think he is a guy that legitimately has top quarterback potential and could be, a Patrick Mahomes level second season that we saw from Mahomes a couple of years ago.
Well, yeah, like we were talking about it, Josh Allen last offseason. We had that quote unquote top quarterback tier, that tier 1. And Josh Allen was always that guy that was on that fringe between the next tier and that tier 1. He was always that guy. That's how I view Justin Herbert. You guys would have seen that graphic, but I have Justin Herbert in that kind of tier on his own where he's not exactly in that elite of the elite yet, but I would much prefer him over the next tier of guys we're going to be talking about. So the sky is the limit for a guy in Justin Herbert who's got all the physical tools to take that ascension into Josh Allen type territory. So I fully agree here. He's got the weapons. He's got the talent. Now let's just see him capitalize on that and build off that rookie year. So we can head into the next guy, and that's actually going to be Russell Wilson, quarterback from the Seattle Seahawks. Currently my 7 and your 9. As you guys will see, we actually have a tie from 7 to 9, which all interchangeable for us. But when talking about Russell Wilson, I mean, he finds himself as our consensus 7 because he's just as consistent as they come from a total output standpoint. We're going to get into the overall question marks around his week-to-week consistency, but we're still talking about a guy who's finished as a top 10 fantasy football quarterback every year since he came into the NFL and top 5 quarterback 4 times since 2013. So as consistent as they come overall, but the problem that I have with him is that, again, we mentioned with Kyler Murray, kind of tale of 2 seasons. That was what Russell Wilson was last year. We're talking about a guy in the first 8 weeks of the season that was legitimately the consensus MVP. Nobody and their mother would have had this guy not being the MVP after those first 8 games. For reference, you guys could see the splits on the screen. Over 32 fantasy points per game. And I believe he was averaging, it's here, 3.5 passing touchdowns per game in that stretch. If you guys don't know what that is, 3.5 passing touchdowns per game in a 16-game season, he would have had 50 touchdowns. He would have smashed 50 touchdowns. So overall, I mean, we're talking about a guy who in those first 8 games was on historic pace. And then all of a sudden, those last 8, his fantasy points per game went from 32 to 19. where his passing touchdowns per game dropped from 3.5 to 1.5. Now, I broke it down with DK Metcalf in our Dynasty show, but that had more so to do with the strength of schedule in the second half of the season, that the defenses they were playing against were just absolutely ridiculous. So I do think it's going to find himself in between those numbers, but we're still talking about a guy who, in general, when you're talking about top quarterbacks in the league from a talent standpoint, the only one that has a distinct edge on him is Patrick Mahomes. He could very well be the second most talented player in the league from a quarterback standpoint. So having him any real lower, in my opinion, than top 8 in fantasy because of that week-to-week consistency is just a little too extensive, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I totally agree. The only question marks that we have about Russell Wilson is the fact that now 2 offensive coordinators with Brian Schottenheimer recently and Darrell Breville previous to Brian Schottenheimer have now been fired for being too pass heavy. Brian Schottenheimer and Darrell Bevell have been fired for being too pass heavy. So, I mean, Pete Carroll has this weird obsession with the run. We all want him to let Russ cook, but I have a feeling the cleaver has been taken away for Russ permanently. I don't think he's ever going to get to the let Russ cook level consistently week over week for an entire season. I think you're going to be dealing with, volatility, and he's going to be a guy that is not a streamer necessarily, but is a guy that you definitely want to be playing the matchups with, because unless he can achieve that elite efficiency in a game, which usually only happens if he's playing a bad defense, he's just not going to have the sustained passing volume to get to that elite level consistently over an entire season. Like you said, he's going to finish as probably like QB8 this year, but the road to get there is going to be bumpy. It's going to be rocky, and it's going to be basically like every other game or every other season in Russell Wilson's career.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. So anyways, we can get on to the next option, and that's actually going to be number 8, your quarterback for the team behind you. Take it away with Tom Brady of the Bucs.
Yeah, Tom Brady, outside of Patrick Mahomes and maybe Dak Prescott, I think he has the easiest passing projection in the NFL. I would say he is probably the second or third most likely guy to achieve a 40-plus passing touchdown season. We saw him do it last year, the first year in a Bruce Arians system, when we've seen guys like Carson Palmer, Ben Roethlisberger, Andrew Luck, Jameis Winston, Peyton Manning. All of these guys have struggled their first year in Arians system, and while Brady wasn't perfect last year, he definitely was much better than any of those guys had ever been in that Arians system, and he had an injury-riddled wide receiver core last year. Mike Evans, from the beginning of the season, had a hamstring injury, was basically a decoy the first 3 weeks of the season, struggled with some injuries throughout the season too. He was a decoy in that Bears game a couple weeks into the season. And we had Godwin, who broke his hand. He had lower body injuries as well. And then Antonio Brown wasn't even on the team until week 9. So with those 3 guys hopefully finally healthy for the full season, or at least to start the season, we're looking at a guy that still finished as quarterback 8 despite that. And he was super consistent. I know we always talk about rushing floors with quarterbacks, but when you look at Tom Brady's passing floor, he only had 1 game with 0 passing touchdowns last year, and that was the Saints game where they just got absolutely lambasted. And then he had 7 games with 3 or more passing touchdowns, which is the ceiling that you saw out of Tom Brady last year. And then from week 10 on to the Super Bowl, Brady didn't have a single game without 2+ passing touchdowns. And like I said, once everybody was healthy and Antonio Brown was in the fold, from week 12 on through the Super Bowl, in those 9 games, Tom Brady would have been on pace for 44.5 passing touchdowns and 4,870 yards. This is the real Buccaneers offense. That back half of the season and into the playoffs is what the real Buccaneers offense is. And before you say, oh, he had an easy schedule to close out the season, I'm including the playoffs where he played the Washington defense, the Saints defense, the Packers defense, and the Chiefs defenses, which none of whom are pushovers. So even if you have those pushover defenses at the end of the season, like the Lions, you balance it out with some of those harder defenses. So Tom Brady is a guy that I can absolutely see finishing as the league's MVP this year. He's a guy that I can absolutely see leading the NFL in passing yards and passing touchdowns. And when you have a guy with that kind of ceiling, and his floor is, aided by the fact that he has a top 10 offensive line, aided by the fact that he has probably a top 3 weapons core in the NFL, you can absolutely see a scenario where Tom Brady finishes in the top 3 quarterbacks. And on top of all that, this is a guy that actually does give you some rushing touchdown output. He had 3 rushing touchdowns last year. And anytime they're in a goal-to-go situation, QB sneak with Tom Brady is a play that has been one of the most successful of the last 20 years.
Yeah, no, definitely. I was actually going to mention that. I was going to ask the crowd, what do you guys think Tom Brady had in terms of rushing touchdowns last year? And if you ask anybody, they'd probably think, oh, maybe he had 1. No, he had 3. So he's not going to give you any type of sustained rushing output on the year. We know when we're buying into Tom Brady, we're not getting him because he's going to have 700-800 rushing yards and 8-9 touchdowns. No, but the fact that he was able to contribute, what was that, like 18.6 fantasy points on the ground, it's better than nothing, I guess.
Yeah.
So overall, he's your 7. He's my 9, I believe. Yeah. So this tie for 3, I have Russ 7, Rodgers 8. We're going to talk about him next, and Brady 9. Corey would have it Brady, Rodgers, and Wilson, if that makes sense. So that being said, we can get into the next option. That's going to be Aaron Rodgers, the final quarterback tied for that 7. And this one's easy. He would most likely find himself at 7 overall between us on this list. If we were certain,
I'd have him ahead of Herbert, just to be clear. If Rodgers, we knew his situation was certain, I would have him ahead of Justin Herbert right after those top 5 guys.
Yeah, so overall, like we would know exactly where we'd have him, and it would be much higher than what it currently is. The problem is that there's so many question marks surrounding his stay on the Packers. The reason, despite all that, he still ranks in our top 10 is that no matter where he ends up, we're still looking at possibly the most talented quarterback, apart from maybe Patrick Mahomes, in the league history. So he's coming off an MVP season, and his range of outcomes in terms of overall landing spot leads me to even a team like Denver. If he lands on a team like Denver, for example, you got a young weapons core that I think he can jump into right away and produce. I would be more than fine ranking him currently where I have him, maybe even, as you mentioned, 6 or 7. So Aaron Rodgers, it's literally just the question marks that's keeping him outside of that top 7 for us.
Yeah, and we could go over his points per game splits and his game logs all day, but I think everybody knows how good he was last year. So we're probably just going to save you guys some time by telling you that this is our QB6, probably consensus wise, if his situation clears up. And we'll talk about Watson at the end of the video, why he's not in this range, because again, he would probably be ahead of Justin Herbert for me as well if we knew Deshaun Watson was playing 16 games. But given that this is redraft rankings, we have to go on one season. Deshaun Watson is likely going to get suspended to some degree, so we can't rank him inside our top 12 for right now. And I know no one's doing probably redraft, leagues right now, like drafts. But if you're using these rankings for best ball, then I would say, stay away from Deshaun Watson anywhere inside the top 12 quarterbacks. So Aaron Rodgers, like we said, is our QB9 consensus, tied for QB7, I guess, if you look at the way we all have them ranked. But he would be much higher if we were, taking him at face value and just assuming he's going to be a Green Bay Packer. But where there's smoke, there's fire sometimes. And even if he ends up on the Denver Broncos, I do think it's a slight situation downgrade from what we saw with Green Bay, because we saw him have a bit of a down season from an efficiency perspective in Matt LaFleur's first year, whereas in his second year, he absolutely blew the league up and won the MVP. So transitioning to a new system next year would be a bit of a challenge for him, even as good as he is. So we'd have to rank him a little bit lower than where we would rank him if he were to just stay in Green Bay and have the connection with Adams that we know he has, with Aaron Jones out of the backfield, and with now Robert Tonyan and as tight end core and some of the tertiary receivers that they added to.
Yep. So we can get into the next option. That's going to be the division rival of my number 2 and your number 4. Take it away with Jalen Hurts. And the people that are listening to us are probably surprised we have him this high.
Yeah. You guys know that we don't really believe in the player long-term as a passing threat, but the rushing is what entices us for this year. And before you say, how does that make him different from Dynasty? If you like him in redraft, how can you not like him in Dynasty? Because he's so young. But the reason is because the Eagles decision makers, the GM, the ownership is going to look at his passing output. They're going to look at his completion percentage and how many passing touchdowns he had, passing yardage and stuff. And it's going to weigh more heavily into their decision than it would for fantasy, because in fantasy, rushing is more important than passing. But from a real life NFL perspective, he's got to move the offense. He's got to get the receivers the ball, the tight ends the ball, the running backs the ball. And passing is more important from the NFL perspective. So for them to make a decision on him at the end of this season is going to be more challenging if, let's say, he finishes as quarterback 9 in fantasy, right? Let's say he has 700 rushing yards, 7 touchdowns, like 3,500 yards, 20 to 23 passing touchdowns, but he throws like 14 interceptions. That could finish him as like QB9 on the year, and he could legitimately be out of a job next year, right? They could have a top 10 pick, and they could use that other first round pick, potentially their 3 first round picks, if Carson Wentz is able to start enough games for the Colts and he meets those conditions. They might have 3 1s next year, and they could go up and get another quarterback. But for this year, we're not talking about Dynasty right now. For this year, he could legitimately finish as a top 10 quarterback. The projection, like I said, is very easy. About 3,500 yards, 20 to 23 passing touchdowns, 700-ish rushing yards, 7 rushing touchdowns on the ground would make him enough to finish as the QB 10 this past season. And I think that's about the projection that we're looking towards.
Well,
I don't see an elite ceiling for him. I don't see a top 5 ceiling because I don't think he's a good enough passer, nor do I think he's a better rusher than even Kyler Murray or Josh Allen, to be honest. I think that's about the range of a rusher that we're talking about. I don't think he has 1,000-yard rushing season in his range of outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I agree as well. Obviously, I have him at the same spot as you at 10. But we actually, before going into this video, we wanted to have him at 12, 13. We didn't believe in the guy at all, but we sat down, kind of projected what an ideal season, as you mentioned, would look like for Jalen Hurts. And we went through the numbers. I mean, we landed at about a number that was, I believe, 340 total points, which would have ranked him as last year's quarterback 10, as you mentioned. So as much as we want to hate on the guy as a passer, like, again, I don't hate the guy. I think he was a fine prospect. I just think he's not a starting caliber quarterback at this current point in time. And for an Eagles team long-term, I just don't see it being the case in terms of financial and draft capital commitment to him. But we're mentioning it from a redraft perspective, that would have been the quarterback 10. We got to respect the numbers. We got to respect the math. We got to respect the Konami code factor that he brings to the table. So he's going to rank ahead of some of the guys that we believe are better real-life players.
Right. And speaking of better real-life players, we're going to get into a guy that, from a passing perspective, is probably just a bit behind Tom Brady, Dak Prescott, and Patrick Mahomes. But I think this might be the 4th most favorable projection from a passing perspective. Maybe I'm disrespecting Josh Allen a little bit. Josh Allen's probably up there too. But get into Matthew Stafford, who is currently our consensus QB 11.
Yeah, I mean, Stafford from the Rams, that was the big move of the offseason. But similar to what we mentioned with Brady, he's an elite an elite situation in terms of available volume and disposable weapons, and is really poised to challenge, as you mentioned, for the league title in both passing yards and passing touchdowns. I mean, it's clear that McVay really had enough of Jared Goff, who, for reference, if you're wondering about production, finished as a top 6 and a top 13 quarterback option, respectively, in 2018 and 19, that he was willing to ship Goff and 2 first-round picks to make that upgrade and get Stafford despite his injury concerns. Stafford has long been one of the most talented and underappreciated quarterbacks in the entire league. And now he has an opportunity to finally be paired with adequate weaponry and a huge amount of volume while working under one of the best creative masterminds in the league under Sean McVay. Again, don't be surprised if this guy challenges for that 2021 MVP. This can be a very good team. They're going to score the ball a lot. And Matt Stafford should figure in that 4,500 to 5,000 passing yard range and probably challenge for about 36 to 45 touchdowns between that range in terms of a passing total. So overall, I mean, getting him outside the top 10 just kind of goes to show you how top heavy the quarterbacks are this year, because in usual years, the numbers that we expect for him would be the quarterback 7, would be the quarterback 8, similar to what we saw from Brady last year.
Yeah, and Matthew Stafford, the situation with Stafford and the Rams to me reminds me a lot of Carson Palmer going to the Cardinals. And I think it's even better of a situation because I would say that Sean McVay is a better coach and play caller than Bruce Arians, as much as I love Bruce Arians. And I think the weapons around Matthew Stafford in Los Angeles, the protection around him, the running back behind him is better than the situation in Arizona. So with Matthew Stafford, I legitimately see, like you said, he could legitimately win the MVP this year. I think he has that type of output potential. I think he has that type of ceiling. We have never seen this guy in an ideal situation. Yeah, he had Calvin Johnson for all those years, but that's it. Like he never had great protection. He never had a great coach, never had great play calling. He never had a litany of weapons that he has right now. And they're talking about adding Julio Jones to this mix. And that could be an absolutely absurd situation if they add Julio Jones. I think Matthew Stafford has as much of a ceiling as any pocket passing level quarterback in any part of this draft in fantasy.
Yeah, and for reference, you mentioned Carson Palmer. I think that's a great comparison because we're talking about a guy in Carson Palmer in that 2015 season being a 36-year-old quarterback, had 4,600 passing yards and 35 passing touchdowns at 11 interceptions. That finished him as the quarterback 5 that year. I can absolutely see Stafford even blowing those numbers out of the water. I mean, 35 touchdowns, I think, would be the low part of Stafford's projection with the Rams. And 11 passing interceptions, I think he doesn't even get to that total. So overall, talking about a guy, again, MVP favorite at this point, I would consider him a top 5 to 6 option for that award.
Yeah, and again, like I said, a system that is easier for quarterbacks to adjust to, much easier than Bruce Arians' system. So, yeah, it's his first year in the system, but Carson Palmer probably wasn't ever as talented as Matthew Stafford was with Cincinnati, and it's a harder system, and the weapons protection play caller is a little bit worse. So like I said, upgraded version of what we saw with Carson Palmer in 2015. Totally would not shock me if this guy's a top 3, top 5 quarterback in fantasy. I don't think he has QB1 potential, even if he does win the MVP award, just because between those top 5 guys and some of the other guys with rushing output, they could outscore him in fantasy, even if Matthew Stafford wins the MVP, just because that's how fantasy scoring works for rushing quarterbacks. And maybe it's a flawed system. That's just how it works.
Yeah, for sure. Might have to be on the case for going to 6-point passing touchdown leagues because it gives more value to those passing quarterbacks. So get into another guy that should expect elite passing volume, and one that's very young but coming off a devastating injury to his season last year. Take it away with Joe Burrow.
Yeah, and Joe Burrow was a hard guy for me to rank, right? I feel like QB12 is too high for him just because of the concerns coming off of the knee injury. How much is he going to be in terms of mobility? We saw Carson Wentz fall off from a play style and a play level perspective once he had his ACL tear and reconstructive surgery. So with Joe Burrow, we saw an up and down rookie season, but Burrow should be better protected with Jonah Williams as a second-year player and Riley Reif coming in to replace Bobby Hart, surrounded by playmakers. We know that they added Jamar Chase in the draft. He has T. Higgins, he has Tyler Boyd, he has Joe Mixon in the backfield, and Zach Taylor has shown a propensity to just absolutely throw the living crap out of the ball.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, 40.1 passing attempts per game in the games he played in 2020, just ridiculous volume. You combine that with the fact you mentioned the additions to the offensive line, but they also add one of the most elite wide receiver talents that the draft probably has seen in quite a while. I mean, Jamar Chase was my wide receiver too. I thought he was a fantastic prospect regardless. You get him at that 5th overall pick, give him that weapon that we saw made magic in 2019. And we haven't even mentioned the hire of Frank Pollack to potentially increase the play or improve the play of that offensive line. So overall, I think the sky is the limit for Joe Burrow. And I wouldn't be shocked if we're talking about a guy a year from now coming off a top 7 or 8 total fantasy quarterback season.
Yeah, and like we said, this guy could absolutely take that step into an elite quarterback from a passing perspective or something like that, because I do believe he showed enough in his rookie season to, challenge Justin Herbert for Offensive Rookie of the Year. Like, I legitimately think he played that well. Obviously, the passing volume is the enticing thing here and the weapons around him, so that's going to, elevate him up to fantasy quarterback potential and fantasy star potential, because his rushing output is fine. I think he can run the ball, but it's not an allure of his. It's just an added bonus. He's like a Ryan Tannehill, Daniel Jones level rusher of the ball, but he's not going to ever get to Josh Allen or even probably Justin Herbert levels of rushing the ball, in my opinion. So Joe Burrow is our consensus QB12. We'll just get into some honorable mentions to close out our top 15 real quick. Like we said with Deshaun Watson, he would absolutely be on this list, but we don't really know what to expect from a suspension standpoint. We don't even know if he's still going to be on the Houston Texans. That's been kind of really quiet ever since these allegations started coming out. So if you're doing a best ball draft right now, which is what I'd assume you're using these redraft rankings for, just avoid Deshaun Watson, to be honest, until he gets to a point that you're comfortable taking him. And for me, that point is about the QB 20 when you're deciding between him and like Sam Darnold or something like that. And the other honorable mentions that we have, both me and Danny have some order of like Matt Ryan and Ryan Tannehill as our QB 13 and 14, both guys that are more pocket style passers and should be up there in terms of passing yardage and passing production. I have concerns about Ryan Tannehill losing some of his weapons. I'm sure you do as well. And his offensive coordinator in Arthur Smith. On the flip side, we have Matt Ryan getting Arthur Smith as his offensive coordinator, maybe not passing the ball quite as much as we're used to from the Atlanta Falcons, and the impending Julio Jones situation as well.
Yep, absolutely. And each of us kind of at that 15 spot has a different mind. So I have Kirk Cousins in there. You still got a really good offense around him. Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen. Talked about the emergence of Irv Smith Jr. potentially this year. And you still got Dalvin Cook in town to contribute in the passing game. And you actually have Ryan Fitzpatrick, newly of the Washington football team. So you can touch on that a bit.
Yeah, Ryan Fitzpatrick to me is in a situation that Ryan Fitzpatrick's never been in. He's a full-level starting quarterback, and I know we used to have this narrative that he turns into Fitz-tragic when he fully gets a starting job, but I don't think that's the case anymore. I think this is legitimately a top 20 quarterback in the NFL at worst, maybe even a top 15 quarterback from a talent and an efficiency standpoint. So this is a Grizzly veteran finally getting his opportunity behind what I would consider a good coaching staff, good play caller, great weapons now with Terry McLaurin, Curtis Samuel coming in. They drafted Diami Brown. They have Kelvin Harmon coming back from injury. Logan Thomas emerged at tight end. He's got 2 good running backs, Offensive line's pretty solid. They added Charles Leno at left tackle. I think this is a great situation. And I think Ryan Fitzpatrick is going to be consistently one of my biggest targets in best ball drafts and a target for me as a late round quarterback guy, because I think he legitimately has top 10 quarterback potential. Yeah, he doesn't run the ball as much as some of the higher end guys, but if I'm going to wait at quarterback, this is exactly the type of guy that I want.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I have him closer to that 20 range, but I fully understand and acknowledge the upside. The problem that I have, again, you kind of mentioned the stigma around him. It's still kind of valid to a point that we haven't really seen it sustained apart from maybe 1 year in his career with the Jets a couple years ago for a full season. But if he performs up to expectation, you still have a very good weapons group with Washington football team. We mentioned the potential emergence of Antonio Gibson this year. You got Curtis Samuel signed in the offseason. You drafted De'Ami Brown to go with Logan Thomas and Terry McLaurin on that offense. So the offensive potential for this team is very high. So the quarterback, in theory, is going to be able to produce.
Yeah, and when you're talking about quarterbacks in any kind of fantasy position in general, but quarterbacks especially, just target good offenses, good quarterbacks with good weapons groups around them. And one last honorable mention I'll make is I have Baker Mayfield at QB 16, who is also in a very good situation with a great play caller and good weapons. I could absolutely see him bordering on that top 10 quarterback range as well. Again, probably not a ceiling of like a top 3 quarterback because he doesn't run the ball as much as some of these other guys. And I don't think he has the passing ceiling of a Dak Prescott, a Patrick Mahomes, Tom Brady, Matthew Stafford type. So he's a guy that is probably a great late round target as well, but not a guy that's going to have an extreme ceiling.
Yeah, that's definitely fair. And I have Trevor Lawrence at 16. And to simply put it, you got the arm talent, you got the mobility. That's all you really need to finish as a top 16 quarterback, in all honesty, especially if you're playing 16 games. So anyways, we can kind of end off this video with, if you made it this far and you enjoyed the content, as always, make sure you go smash that like button. Helps us with that YouTube algorithm. And yeah, stay tuned this week.
Comment down below first dose, because this was the first dose of redraft ranking. So if you guys enjoyed, like Danny said, comment, subscribe. We are bordering on 3,500 subscribers. We're hoping to get to it by the end of May, which is today. So as you're watching this video, if you haven't already subscribed, please go ahead and do so. We have a lot of content coming at you guys, pretty much daily content for the rest of the summer into fantasy drafts. And we are going to help. We're going to do everything that we can do to make you guys the most educated fantasy players that we can do, share our own research, have spirited discussions in the comments, but we're all here to learn. We're all here to, get better. Join the Discord if you want some more fantasy advice. If you're new to fantasy, there's plenty of other educated fantasy football fans and players that can help you learn as well.
Yeah, definitely. So with that being said, peace out, y'all.